You can be extremely good at what you do and still build a weak personal brand because being knowledgeable is not the same as being known for something. Think about it. If I ask you to name someone for fitness, you probably have a few names immediately. Someone for business strategy, someone for investing, someone for productivity, someone for storytelling. But now ask yourself a slightly uncomfortable question. What would people say you are the person for? If the answer takes too long, you probably don't have a knowledge problem. You have a positioning problem. If we haven't met before, I'm Yuvan Atre. I'm the founder of Strategy to Screen, where we help people build personal brands through strategic video content. Brands that people remember, trust, and want to follow. And this is the second dimension in this series of 7 dimensions of personal branding. The first one was expertise. And expertise is the foundation because obviously you need something valuable to bring to the table. But expertise creates a slightly strange problem. The more you know, the more things you can talk about. And the more things you can talk about, the harder it becomes for people to understand what they should remember you for. That's where positioning comes in. I think positioning is one of those words that gets used so much in marketing that we've almost forgotten what it actually means. People hear positioning and immediately think about a tagline or a niche or some clever sentence you put in your Instagram bio. But positioning is much bigger than that. Positioning is essentially answering one question. When someone thinks about a particular problem, audience, or category, what do you want them to associate with you? That's it. And this becomes incredibly important in personal branding because your audience is not keeping a database of everything you know. They're not sitting there thinking, Yuvan knows strategy, storytelling, communication, psychology, business, content, video. No. Their brain is trying to simplify you. They want a shortcut. Who is this person? What do they talk about? Is this relevant to me? Why should I listen to them instead of somebody else? And your positioning is that shortcut. Which is why I look at positioning through 6 elements. Not because there are magically only 6 things that matter, but because these 6 questions force you to become clear about the space you want to occupy. The first one is your target audience. And this is where I think a lot of people get unnecessarily scared. They hear target audience and think, wait, does that mean I have to choose one tiny niche and talk about only one thing for the rest of my life? No, that's not the point. The point is that your content needs to have someone in mind. Because if you are speaking to everyone, you are actually speaking to no one. Take 2 consultants. The first one says, I help businesses grow. Okay. Which businesses? At what stage? With what problem? What kind of growth? It is very difficult to build a strong association around that. Now imagine the second consultant says, I help B2B founders fix their sales process when they are stuck between founder-led sales and building a real sales systems. Suddenly, I understand something. I know who is it for. I know what problem they're dealing with. And I can immediately think of someone who might need this. That's the power of defining your audience. Specificity makes your expertise easier to recognize. And interestingly, you don't necessarily become smaller by becoming more specific. You often become more valuable to the right people. Which brings us to the second element, your core message. Once you know who you are speaking to, you need to know what you repeatedly want them to understand about you. And I say repeatedly because this is where personal branding becomes very different from random content creation. If every video introduces a completely different version of you, people have to start from zero every time. One week you're talking about leadership, next week you're talking about productivity, and then AI, then fitness, then entrepreneurship, then storytelling. All of these things might be interesting, but what is the thread? What is the idea underneath all of them? Your core message is that thread. For S2S, for example, the broader idea isn't simply making better videos. It's the belief that experts already have valuable knowledge, but that knowledge needs to become visible before it can become scalable authority. That's a much stronger idea because now individual videos can talk about positioning, communication, storytelling, expertise, trust, video strategy, but they are still reinforcing the same larger belief. That's what makes a personal brand feel like a brand instead of a collection of posts. And then comes the third element, value proposition. And this is slightly different from your core message. Your core message is what you want people to understand. Your value proposition is why should they care? What do they actually get from following you, listening to you, or eventually working with you? And this is where a lot of personal brands become very self centered. They communicate what they know, they talk about their experience, they share their achievements. But the audience is quietly thinking, okay, but how does that help me? That's the test. If your content consistently helps me solve a problem, understand something differently, make better decision, avoid a mistake, or see an opportunity I couldn't see before, you have created value. And over time, something interesting happens. People stop following you simply because they like your content. They start following you because your thinking is useful to them. That's a much stronger relationship. And it leads directly into the fourth element, differentiation. Because let's be honest, there are millions of people creating content about business, marketing, fitness, leadership, investing, productivity, health. So being useful is not enough. There has to be a reason I remember you. And differentiation doesn't necessarily mean inventing something nobody has ever said before. That's an unrealistic standard. Sometimes differentiation comes from the way you think about a familiar problem, your experience, your point of view, the audience you understand particularly well, the problems you have solved repeatedly, the frameworks you have developed, the connections you make between seemingly unrelated ideas. For example, two people can talk about personal branding. One might approach it entirely from a marketing perspective. Another might look at it through psychology and trust. Another might approach it through business development. Some other might focus on communication and video. They are all talking about personal branding, but they are not occupying the same position. And that's important. Your differentiation is not necessarily what you talk about. Sometimes it's how you think about what you talk about. And this is also where your expertise becomes useful. Because the deeper your expertise, the more likely you are to have observations that aren't obvious from the outside. That's the raw material for differentiation. Now, here's where positioning gets interesting. You can have the right audience, a strong message, a clear value proposition, something genuinely differentiated, and still have weak positioning because of the fifth element, which is messaging consistency. And consistency here does not mean repeating the exact same sentence in every video. It means that your audience keep encountering the same underlying idea from different angles. Think about the people you know who have strong personal brands. You probably don't remember one exact sentence they said. You remember a pattern. You know what they care about. You know the kinds of problems they talk about. You know the way they approach those problems. You know roughly what you are going to get when you click on their content. That's consistency. And that is where I think people misunderstand content variety. You can have variety in your content without having variety in your positioning. That's actually what you want. Different stories, different examples, different problems, different formats, but the same intellectual territory. Because repetition creates recognition, recognition creates familiarity, and familiarity over the time creates trust. Which is why I don't think the goal of a personal brand should be to constantly surprise people with a completely new identity. The goal is to become predictably valuable. And then we arrive at the sixth element, which is positioning clarity. And honestly, this is the outcome of all the previous five. Can somebody who has watched three of your pieces of your content can explain what you are about? Can they say, oh, this person helps people like me solve this kind of a problem, or this is the person I go to when I want to understand this particular subject? If they can't, your positioning may be too complicated. And this is where I would like to challenge something that a lot of personal branding advisors tell you. People often try to make their positioning sound impressive. They add more words, more categories, more credentials, more adjectives. Something like strategic transformation and growth advisor, helping visionary leaders unlock exponential potential. Okay, but what do you actually do? If I need to read your bio 3 times to understand what you are known for, that positioning isn't sophisticated. It's very much unclear. Clarity beats cleverness. And there's another reason this matters specifically for video. Video gives you enormous amount of space to demonstrate your positioning. You're not limited to just saying, I am a leadership coach. You can actually show them how you think about leadership. You can break down a difficult situation. You can tell a story. You can challenge an assumption. You can explain frameworks. You can solve a problem. And after watching 10 of your videos, they should have a much stronger understanding of what you are than they did after reading your bio. That's what good positioning through content looks like. So if I put all of 6 pieces together, the question becomes quite simple. Who are you speaking to? That's your target audience. What do you repeatedly want them to understand about you? That's your core message. What meaningful value do you create for them? That's your value proposition. Why should they remember you instead of someone else? That is your differentiation. Are you reinforcing the same underlying idea over time? That's messaging consistency. And finally, can people actually explain what you are known for? That is positioning clarity. And notice something? None of these questions are really about content. They're about identity. Content is simply the medium through which that identity becomes visible. That's why at Strategy to Screen, we don't believe you should start with, what should I post this week? The better question is, what do I want to become known for? Then, who needs to know me for that? Then, what do I need to consistently demonstrate so they understand it? And only after that do you get to, what videos should I make? Because if you skip positioning and go straight to content, you can end up creating a lot of content that is individually good, but collectively meaningless. And that's a dangerous place to be. Because you can have views without recognition, you can have followers without relevance, you can have expertise without authority, and you can have content without a brand. Positioning is what starts connecting all of that. So if the first pillar of personal branding is expertise, positioning is what tells the market where that expertise belongs. You don't need to talk about everything you know. You need to make it easier for the right people to understand what you know, why it matters to them, and why they should remember you for it. And once we have covered expertise and positioning, the next dimension we are going to talk about is visibility. Because knowing what you're good at and knowing how you want to be positioned is one thing. Actually getting that expertise in front of the right people consistently, that's a completely different challenge. So that's what we'll unpack in the next video. And if you haven't watched the previous video in this series where I broke down expertise as the first dimension of personal branding, I recommend watching that before you move on. Click on it and watch that one next. Because positioning becomes much easier to understand once you have the foundation of expertise clear. If you want more strategic thinking around personal branding, positioning, content, and video, then subscribe to this channel. See you in the next one.